J. Alfred Broadus Jr. became the 6th president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond in 1993 and held that position until his retirement in 2004. A native of Richmond, Al holds a bachelor's degree from Washington and Lee and a doctorate in economics from Indiana University. After serving in the U.S. Army and then working for the Defense Intelligence Agency, Al joined the staff at the Richmond Fed, first as economist, then as vice president, senior vice president, and director of research, and finally, bank president. At Richmond, Al often collaborated with Marvin Goodfriend, not only on their policy statements, but on the basic research that laid down the strongest of foundations for their ambitious agenda. I mentioned this earlier, but a lot of the ideas that Al and Marvin introduced seemed radical at first, but gradually became part of the vernacular as their usefulness became clear. In 2003, for example, Marvin and Al wrote the annual report article for the Richmond Fed, proposing that the FOMC explicitly and publicly announce a 2% target for long-run inflation as measured by the price index for personal consumption expenditures. About 10 years later, the FOMC did exactly that. It's a real honor to have Al here with us today. Won't you please join me in welcoming him as our very special guest?
Thank you very much, Peter. It's great to be with you folks this afternoon. You know, it's routine for a speaker to begin a talk like this by saying what a pleasure it is to be with whoever he might be with. But when I say it today, I really mean it. I am truly overjoyed to see Marvin recognized and honored by this distinguished group of his colleagues. And I might just add, it's a special pleasure to see his wife Marcia and his sister Miriam and his niece and her husband here also to listen, watch, and enjoy as we honor him. I think I can tell you the exact date and place where I first met Marvin. Not 100% sure, but pretty sure. It was, I believe, Wednesday, December the 28th, 1977. Bob Hetzel, who's here, and I were in a room in the New York Hilton, not far from here, interviewing prospects, young economists to bring into the research department at the Richmond Fed. So we were there interviewing candidates. Bob stepped out of the room to get a cup of coffee for a minute, I guess, and then came back, and without any further introduction, looked at me and just said, "G. William Miller." I guess a big question mark must have appeared in the bubble over my head. So Bob quickly added that Jimmy Carter had just nominated Mr. Miller to succeed Arthur Burns as Fed chair. That news digested, we returned to interviewing candidates. Little did I know that one of the most important and fortunate events of my life was about to occur. When the final candidate of the day knocked on the door, it was getting dark in Manhattan, and I remember being weary. Marvin was the candidate. I don't recall for sure, but I would be willing, I don't know what shoes he had on, someone mentioned that earlier, but I would be willing to bet that he had on a brown and tan sweater with an argyle pattern, a sort of sweater vest, I guess, because he wore that for many years afterwards. So I don't remember exactly that for sure, but I do recall that my first impression of Marvin as we went through the interview was altogether positive. There was none of the awkwardness and resume bolstering that sometimes characterizes interviews in those meetings. I remember thinking to myself towards the end of the interview, you know, with this guy, what you see is what you will get. And I remember as he left, I liked him very much, and I was sure that it would be wonderful to try to attract him to Richmond. But we were trying to find good qualified people, and we were interviewing very good qualified people to try to bring them to our department and strengthen the substantive contribution we could make to monetary policy. But I remember as he left, I was thinking our chances of getting him to come to Richmond, Virginia are probably pretty slim. So you can imagine what a pleasure it was for me to learn not long after that he would accept our offer. I would have been even happier had I known that he would stay for almost 30 years and that I would have an opportunity to work closely with him through most of that time. This conference is well designed to cover the main areas of Marvin's policy research and his influence on monetary policy in the U.S. And beyond. I've enjoyed the morning session, and what I want to do is just comment on a few of the things that Bob Hetzel and I and Marvin's other Richmond colleagues over the years watched him accomplish at close range, and also try to give you a little bit of the flavor of what it was like to work on a day-to-day basis with Marvin. Many of you in this room have also had that experience and know what it's like, but let me just give you my personal take on it to the extent that I can. As I think we all know, and as has been very clear throughout the discussion this morning, a central theme that motivates virtually all of Marvin's work is the overarching importance of credibility in conducting monetary policy successfully, and B, the closely related essential need to keep the Fed, or any central bank for that matter, independent within the government and its policy decisions and actions well separated from fiscal policy, Treasury actions outside the Fed's purview, and partisan politics. As I see it, this theme, which clearly was derived from Marvin's early embrace of rational expectations ideas, was not only a guiding principle, but something that really enables most of his policy positions and proposals. Credibility, in particular, for Marvin, was not a soft concept, but a critical precondition of effective monetary policy that should be built into the expectations components of policy models, measured and monitored. These views are conventional now, but Marvin embraced them well before they became standard, and as you know, he argued for them relentlessly throughout his career. Needless to say, this strongly held central theme of Marvin's research and advocacy affected not only Marvin, but all of his colleagues in the research department at the Richmond Fed while he was there. Early on, Marvin's arrival in the department required, to put it gently, some adjustments by all of us. Essentially, a higher bar for the quality of our research and the quality of our policy advice to Bob Black, who was then the president of the bank. Actually, and fortunately, an initial round of similar adjustments had been occasioned by the arrival of Bob Hetzel, freshly minted out of the University of Chicago. He, of course, wrote his PhD thesis under Milton Friedman, and I will be forever grateful to Bob for getting me ready for Marvin. Against this background, what follows are just a few observations on three experiences that I recall especially well in Marvin's quarter-century collaboration with Bob, me, and the rest of the Richmond staff, and some of the impacts of each of these on our bank and its research effort. These, of course, will mainly be events from the 1980s and 1990s, which sound almost quaint in today's environment. I was worried about that before getting here, but as it turns out, much of the discussion this morning was about these same events, so I feel more comfortable now. But in any event, I think a key thing is the things that we worked on and discussed back in the 80s and 90s. Obviously, the lessons we learned there are still, with respect to things like credibility, are still very much relevant today in the issues the Fed is facing now. But just three of these things, and I'll try to go through these quickly. The first of these was the writing and eventual publication of Marvin's seminal paper on transparency, monetary mystique, secrecy, and central banking. If memory serves, Marvin began working on this very soon after he arrived at the bank. My guess is he might have been thinking about it even sooner than that. As many here are probably aware, early drafts of this paper made a number of people in the Fed uncomfortable, not least in Richmond, I might add. At the time, I think it's fair to say, there was a broad cultural consensus in the Fed that the Fed was inherently and continuously exposed to often politically motivated external scrutiny and attack. So the wagons needed to be pretty much continuously circled, and responsibility for protecting the Fed and the part of the public interest that the Fed served resided primarily in Washington. In retrospect, this was arguably natural enough and understandable. Marvin's paper challenged this arrangement, as you all know, specifically when an early version of it was sent to the board for review. As you all know, the Merrill lawsuit forced the Fed, actually the FOMC, to provide an explicit defense of its routine delay in releasing policy directives after FOMC meetings. Marvin scrutinized this defense rigorously, using relevant tools of economic analysis, including rational expectations. What caused discomfort, I think, was that the FOMC's defense of this secrecy, of its practice of secrecy, took the form of affidavits submitted during the litigation by one of the board members and senior staff at the board. So Marvin was directly and potentially publicly challenging these statements and their authors, albeit in a professional and, I think, balanced manner. Board positions had certainly been challenged before, notably by the St. Louis Fed, but not so much by us in Richmond. So hands needed to be held in Richmond, including mine. Over time, a fair amount of time actually, things worked out. Marvin never wavered. I guess I did. We didn't publish Marvin's paper in our flagship publication, which I regret in retrospect, but of course it was published in 1986 in the Journal of Monetary Economics, and has played a significant role, as has been mentioned many times this morning, in the advancement of transparency in the conduct not only of Fed monetary policy, but monetary policy around the world. More parochially, it also permanently set a higher standard for our bank's efforts to contribute meaningfully to monetary policy. So while there were some bumps along the way, the overall experience, as far as I'm concerned, was altogether positive all around. A second experience our policy team in Richmond shared with Marvin was our especially active participation in FOMC meetings in 1994. 1994 was an eventful year for the FOMC and for us. It was my first year as a voting FOMC member, with Marvin as my official advisor. Now, this last point might give the impression that Marvin reported to me, but let me assure you that, especially on matters of monetary policy and many other things as well, I reported to Marvin. With this in mind, and with me serving in large measure as his audio system at the FOMC table, Marvin was now positioned to convey his current views, but also his core principles that I discussed above, through me directly to the FOMC. He sat directly behind me at the meetings, and trust me when I tell you that I could feel the heat. Several issues arose during the year. The first was whether the Fed would act promptly and with sufficient force to preempt any material increase in inflation, or equally important, emerging inflation expectations as the economy completed its recovery from the 1991 recession. Marvin had been greatly impressed, I think this was said earlier this morning, Marvin was greatly impressed by the preemption of inflation that Chairman Volcker had overseen in 1983 and 1984 in particular. Along with others, Marvin wanted an encore. To that end, we argued for relatively aggressive tightening at each meeting throughout the year 1994, which of course occurred, but not as aggressively as we wanted it to in September, and that was the first meeting in which I dissented. FOMC meetings back then were pretty scripted. I'm not sure how, my sense is that's less the case now, but that was the case then. So Marvin drafted carefully reasoned and worded statements for me to deliver. And he would resist, and our routine was to have a discussion of our statement and a polishing of it at meetings on Sunday afternoon in the weekend before an FOMC meeting. typically, I would try to soften some of the language. Marvin could be pretty strident with the view to making it a little bit more acceptable to some of the other members of the committee, but Marvin would resist that, so an exchange might go something like this. I might say, Marvin, I think we would be more persuasive if we used a little bit different language here, maybe not quite so aggressive and soft, put a couple of additional phrases in here or there, to which Marvin would reply, Al, you can make that change if you want to, but it will gut my whole point. He also graded my performances. Most FOMC members fly back and forth for meetings, but Richmond is close to Washington, so we drove. So on our drive back, our typical routine was that he would grade my performance, and as you expect, he would punches that needed to be landed, he would not pull. He never did. But there's no question in my mind that these critiques served me well and our overall effort in Richmond. In any case, Marvin believed that the FOMC's preemptive actions in 1994 anchored in inflation expectations in the U.S., and I believe that Marvin's advocacy played a significant role in that result. That was a great accomplishment for the FOMC. 1994, incidentally, was also the year in which, at Marvin's instigation, we at the FOMC table argued strongly against Fed involvement in the Treasury's initiatives to lend money to Mexico, which was going through a currency crisis at the time, as a way of helping Mexico, but also keeping that situation from migrating to other international financial markets. While persuasive arguments were made supporting such actions, Congress had explicitly declined to authorize them, and Marvin in particular was appropriately concerned that Fed involvement in those actions would threaten our independence, and we worked together to make that statement as strongly as we could in the meetings where that was discussed in 1994. Later in 1994, Marvin pushed me to dissent against renewal of the foreign exchange swap lines because, in his view and mine, as a result of his tutoring me on it, he felt that undermined the credibility of Fed monetary policy, in part for a number of reasons, but in part because it didn't work well. And an example that underlined this at the time was, some of you may remember that, I think it was in June of that year, there was a big joint foreign exchange intervention to deal with the dollar was weakening, to strengthen the dollar. What was notable about that was that actually showed up on the front page of the Richmond paper. That really got Marvin's attention, and we made that point, I think, in the meeting. Marvin, so I dissented, but as always with the dissent, you have to have an explanation. So we wrote up with Marvin's guidance, we wrote up a dissent, and Marvin insisted that I repeat that dissent verbatim in FOMC meetings forever after, for the remainder of my career. He would recommend that. I would object, trying to make the point that, Marvin, look, the FOMC has heard me say this for year after year, and Marvin would say, play it again, Sam. A final example of our experience working with Marvin occurred not long before both Marvin and I left the Fed. You may recall the tax revenues arising from the tech boom produced federal budget surpluses back in 2001 and 2002. Treasury debt outstanding was declining, and the FOMC had begun to worry about what it might do in the event that the supply of of Treasury securities was insufficient and inadequate for the Fed to conduct its routine open market operations. There was a subcommittee, I think, chaired by, I guess, Don Cohen has left. I think you and Peter Fisher ran that committee, if I recall, Don. And what Marvin thought the way to deal with this was to have the Treasury issue some additional special bonds that we could buy, so that, in keeping with some of the things that were said earlier, we could continue a Treasury's only monetary policy operation. So Marvin prepared a script for me to present to the committee, and I did that. Chairman Greenspan, with his usual attention to double-entry bookkeeping, wanted to know at the end of my statement what the Treasury would do with the proceeds of these bond buys. He basically wanted, his idea, of course, was, well, if we do this, won't the Treasury then wind up holding these assets? So he said that. I mumbled something. Greenspan repeated the question. Marvin was clearly alarmed that I was about to blow it. So he raised his hand from the back bench and asked if he could respond to the question. I said sure, but I wasn't sure what Chairman Greenspan would say. In almost 30 years of attending FOMC meetings, either as an advisor or as a member of the committee, I had never heard someone from the back chairs stand up and intervene in an FOMC meeting without being invited to do so by someone. I suppose I should have been embarrassed, because if it were not already clear, it was clear from that he was really driving monetary policy from the Richmond Fed's views on policy, at least at that meeting. But I was proud of Marvin, and the point that needed to be made was made. I was also thankful and impressed at Chairman Greenspan's reaction. He didn't. It was I guess a breach of protocol, but he showed no concern or even surprise. And he, at the end, had a brief and comfortable exchange with Marvin. I could continue and talk about Marvin's key contributions to the inflation targeting debate, his important contributions to analysis on how the Fed and other central banks should deal with the zero lower bound, his great personal courage in the face of threats he received when his carry tax on money paper hit the internet. Coming from Richmond, Virginia. I could also elaborate on the great satisfaction that Bob Hetzel and I and our Richmond colleagues took from working with Marvin, and our gratitude to him for what he did for all of us individually, and innumerable one-on-one discussions about one point or another, assistance on research. I had some of those walks with Marvin as well. I used to stay late at night at the bank, and Marvin did, and we had some wonderful, wonderful conversations in the wee hours of the night and morning. And also, of course, I could talk about how grateful we are at the Richmond Fed collectively for what he did for the standing of our bank, and most of all, for the blessing of his friendship. Marvin, as many people have said, and I can only repeat, was a wonderful, wonderful human being. He was my great colleague, my greatest professional colleague, but really one of the greatest friends I ever hope to have. So let me, I'm getting close to my time limit, and I'm sure you're tired of listening to me by now, but let me just say that I take immense pleasure at the very occurrence of this special meeting in Marvin's honor, because it confirms what I and others have long believed, that among those, both inside and outside the Fed, who've worked long and hard to improve the conduct of American monetary policy, Marvin Goodfriend was a giant and an indispensable leader. I only wish he were here today to help us and the Fed deal with some of the big challenges we're facing currently. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Al. We're going to move straight on to the next session.
Okay, well, I'm chairing this session too. This was the one I was supposed to chair. So I'm not substituting for anybody. This is a panel on the effective lower bound, and I have just a few remarks to make before we get into it. So at present, interest rates and inflation are low across the advanced countries. There's threat of a global recession, or at least a pronounced slowdown coming from this new virus. The Fed just cut rates by 50 basis points, and its interest rate policy space has shrunk even further. This raises the question, what should the Fed and other central banks do when we hit the effective lower bound again? Last summer at the Chicago Fed's Policy Strategy Conference, Chairman Powell said that the Fed's greatest challenge is the ZLB, while at the AEA meetings in San Diego very recently, Janet Yellen said that the Fed's out of ammunition. At the same meetings, and I was there, Ben Bernanke argued that the present Fed toolkit is just fine. He expressed confidence that when in the next recession we hit the ELB, the Fed should do just what it did during the last crisis and recession, use quantitative easing and forward guidance. His evidence drew mainly on studies by Federal Reserve Board of Governors staffers and people at Brookings. Moreover, he was skeptical that other approaches, including challenging the inflation target, price level targeting, and negative policy rates would work. The problem is that there's other evidence which suggests that neither QE nor forward guidance were that successful, especially QE3. And I'm just thinking about work with Andy Levin, some with me and some with other people, work with Jim Hamilton, et cetera. So if that evidence is even half correct, the Fed faces the dilemma over what to do the next time. So one approach, which some other central banks are considering, but not so much the Fed, is for central banks to adopt central bank digital currency, both wholesale and retail. And to do it either account-based, possibly with private sector partners, or token-based. And to follow Marvin Goodfriend's suggestion in 2012 and cut the interest rate on CBDC to whatever negative value would reflate or recover the economy. While Marvin's logic is impeccable, in practice there's some pushback against negative rates in the central bank world. We heard some of that today. Based on the banking experience, systems of what happened to the banking systems in some European economies in Japan, although not all the European central banks that have done this agree with this assessment. My point is that none of these countries had both central bank digital currency and negative rates. In such an environment, negative rates might be more effective and eventually socially and politically acceptable. The debate about the potential for central bank digital currency to alter monetary policy trade-offs is currently a work in progress and has some way to go before it's resolved. However, so I'll just mention that. And given these thoughts, I just want to pose a number of questions to the panel. What's the likelihood that the Fed would continue to see zero as the ELB? And what type of challenges with that, whatever the level, what would that pose? The second, if quantitative easing and forward guidance are of limited effectiveness, what other tools in the Fed's existing toolbox can it really rely on to deal with the next downturn? Negative rates, announcing a permanent increase in the inflation rate, inflation target, price level or nominal GDP targeting. Does the Fed really have the tools to deal with the next downturn? And lastly, are there other tools that you consider? Fast tracking central bank digital currency, helicopter money, foreign exchange intervention. So just throwing these ideas out. Like the last panel, each panelist has 15 minutes for his remarks, and I think what we'll do is we'll follow the order of the program, and we'll end with Q&A. So it's Andy first.
So I just want to start by talking again about Marvin. We've heard a lot already. Maybe I'll just add one more thing that I really appreciated about him. Economists are trained to sort of make lots of assumptions. Assumptions are really helpful. That's the only way to kind of put together a model, and then you can analyze the model and see what results come out of it. And that's how we're trained in graduate school. The harder part actually is to question the assumptions, especially the ones that we've been taking for granted for a long time, to think outside the box and say, well, maybe it doesn't have to be that way. And I think Marvin was extraordinary in this. So in the late 90s, people started getting worried about the zero lower bound. Japan was already at the zero lower bound. It was becoming more clear that the United States and other countries could get there too. And my way of describing what Marvin was thinking at the time was, well, maybe we don't have to have a zero bound. Where does the zero bound come from? Well, the simple answer is the zero bound comes from paper cash, from paper dollars, that for historical reasons it was never been practical for paper dollars to pay interest. So the interest rate on paper dollars is zero, and that means that it's impossible for a central bank to cut nominal interest rates much below that, because people always have this option of moving back into paper cash. And Marvin's question was, can we change that? If the zero bound is a significant constraint on monetary policy, can we change that? Can we make monetary policy more flexible? We all agree that it's critical for the central bank to provide a unit of account. I think this came up in this morning's session. How can we make sure that we don't have another Great Depression? How can we make sure that the central bank can prevent prices from falling 30% and unemployment from going up to 25% the way that it happened in the 30s? And so I really admire Marvin's willingness, his courage, I think, came up this morning, and fortitude to question those assumptions and try to think outside the box. And that was certainly an inspiration for me and Michael Bordo in trying to think ourselves the last few years. I think we came up with somewhat different answers to the question, but certainly the basic premise that maybe there's a way to move beyond the zero bound in a way that would really strengthen the Fed's ability to mitigate severe adverse shocks. I guess another thing, Marvin emphasized transparency. This paper that he wrote is published in the JME. President Broadus referred to a few minutes ago, Bob King referred to this morning. This idea that secrecy is a good thing, was so deeply embedded in the Fed culture back then. It's just mind-boggling now. But I think what we should realize is that not communicating can be very dangerous. And the analogy that I want to give to you is a medical analogy. My father's a doctor. A lot of times when I talk to my students in my classes at Dartmouth, we talk about the Monetary Policy Committee is like a team of doctors. They're the team of expert doctors that been appointed and designated to help foster price stability and maximum employment. The patient is the U.S. economy. And it's critical for the Federal Reserve to communicate clearly to the patient. Not communicating, the patient can get very scared. Things may be actually not so bad, but if the doctors aren't explaining that clearly to the patient tends to start worrying about what might go wrong. And that fear, of course, can make the situation a lot worse in a medical situation. Okay. How do doctors consult with a patient and the patient's family in a difficult medical situation? They do communicate very carefully. First of all, what are the test results? This is a little bit like what Jim Bullard and Loretta were saying this morning. What are the indicators we're looking at? What's been happening recently? What's our benchmark diagnosis? Based on what we know right now, what do we think is the benchmark diagnosis? But they don't stop there. They're modest and humble in saying, we don't completely understand everything here, and we are going to keep doing tests, and if the tests come back positive, here's our contingency plans. Identify material risks, formulate contingency plans, explain those to the patient and the patient's family. The Federal Reserve has to start doing this. People called it this morning, and by the way, Mickey Livy has raised this in previous shadow meetings. I think Don Cohn mentioned it, a couple other people talked about scenario analysis, and contingency planning is a basic element of good management at most organizations. And the irony of it is, the Federal Reserve now requires major banks to do stress tests. In fact, the Federal Reserve constructs severe adverse scenario, and it asks the major banks to take that scenario with a fair amount of detail and think about what would they do, what's their plans in that scenario. The irony here is the Federal Reserve should be starting to impose that same discipline on itself. Internally, The staff are looking at that. That's got to be one of the scenarios that they're thinking about. And externally, because we, the American public, and to some extent the global public, are the patient and the patient's family. We should know, what is the backup plan? What's the contingency plan? If things get worse, what's the Federal Reserve going to do? Not to wait until the middle of the surgery and the doctor comes running out and says, oh, sorry, we took out your kid's appendix. But to discuss that ahead of time, to explain and say there's certain circumstances in which we might need to do this procedure. What are the alternatives? And to talk that through. Help the patient stay calm. It's difficult. It takes a lot of diplomacy. Communication's hard. You know that from just personal experience, right? Communicating with your brother or your spouse or your kids is hard. But the alternative of just no communication is not an alternative. So the Federal Reserve needs to start acting like a team of physicians as soon as possible. I think this could come out of the Fed Listens initiative. Maybe by the middle of this year, the Federal Reserve is starting to routinely do some kinds of analysis, scenario analysis and contingency planning. Okay, now let's take the severe adverse scenario that the Fed just published a month ago, that they're asking the major banks to look at. And let's take that and think about it from a monetary policy viewpoint. The synopsis of that scenario is in my paper. If you want to look at it, it's table 1, but it's not that complicated. It's a scenario where the US economy is hit by a pretty severe shock and the unemployment rate goes back up to around 10%, like it did more or less 10 years ago, and starts to come back down in the second or third year of the scenario. The scenario only goes out 3 years, so we actually don't know exactly what Fed staff are assuming for the longer horizon there, okay? But there's a couple of key things that you should notice if you look at the assumptions in that stress test. First of all, when they were formulating it, which was probably in early January, they assumed that the short-term Treasury bill rate in the baseline scenario would be around 1.5% to 2%. And I think actually that Chairman Bernanke, that's probably when he was talking at the AA meeting, probably kind of similar sort of assumption that the first step for the Fed is cut rates by 200 basis points, and that's may not be enough, but at least it's a good start to mitigate a shock, and that's probably part of what's going on here. Another thing is that the baseline scenario has a 10-year Treasury yield of above 2%, which both means there's some room for forward guidance. I'm talking about the future path of the funds rate. That can provide a stimulus in the same way it did in the last recovery. And the potential for doing another round of quantitative easing that would push down longer-term yields. That was the premise of the Fed's QE1, QE2, QE3. Remember, QE1, we think, might have reduced longer-term Treasury yields by 75 basis points. That was one program. They did QE2 and QE3. As Mike said, we have some questions about how well QE3 worked, but leave those aside for the moment and just focus on QE1. In the stress test from 2 months ago, there was clearly room for the Federal Reserve to do 1 or 2 rounds of another thing kind of similar size to QE1 or maybe even twice that big and get a substantial stimulus from it to help offset the severe adverse shock. The problem is, where are we today? I mean, I just checked again before I got up here to speak because every day I've been working on these remarks, it keeps changing, okay? But the 2-year Treasury is now at around 40 basis points, the 5 years at around 50, and the 10 years at around 75. The room for further easing right now is very limited. Now, there's certainly a benchmark scenario. I think this is the one President Bullard was referring to. The benchmark scenario, I think the Federal Reserve, as a good team of physicians, should certainly be reassuring the public. The benchmark scenario for this year is that the coronavirus is contained, that it causes some short-term disruptions, and things start to get back to normal, and maybe even by the end of the year, next year, the Fed's able to raise rates a little bit again. And that's a reassuring benchmark scenario. But do we really think that the patient is unaware of the possibility that there are other more severe adverse scenarios that could happen? Of course the patient knows that. That's why the markets are reacting, because they know that there's a 10 or 20% chance that this could be a lot worse than that. Then they start to get scared by a doctor or a team of physicians who says, we don't know what we're going to do next. Or, oh, we'll probably just do the same thing we did last time. Or what Janet Yellen said. I'm going to read you her quote, because it's kind of stunning to hear this from a former Fed official. She said this at a World Bank forum. Low interest rates have put central banks in a position where they don't have a lot of ammunition. If we have a serious recession, we're probably not going to be able to count on central banks to offer up a significant response. We're not going to be able to count on central banks to offer up a significant response. You know, I don't want to hit too close to home here, but the worst thing you can hear from a doctor is, I'm sorry, there's nothing more we can do to help you. My mother was in that situation a few years ago. She had pulmonary hypertension. It's an untreatable disease, and the doctor told her, you're probably not going to live for more than a year, and she didn't. That's something, we can't have the Federal Reserve or other major central banks say that to the public. It's unacceptable. So if we think that there's adverse scenarios coming soon, potentially, where the Fed cannot use the tools that it used 10 years ago, we have to have new tools. Well, then we come back again to Marvin and to trying to think outside the box. What else can the Federal Reserve do in those circumstances? Now, I don't have much time left. How much time do I have, Mike? 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 0?
No, you got
it doesn't take much time, because Mike and I have been talking about this. We've been writing about it. I appreciate that the Fed had all these Fed Listens things. They never invited Mike to talk at any of their Fed. I wasn't expecting them to invite me, but they never invited Mike. Mike was president of the American Economic History Association. He's a distinguished scholar. He was going to be the keynote speaker at a Bank of England conference in a couple months. The Fed could have asked him to come in and talk to them about these proposals for digital cash. Why wasn't that on the table? It should be on the table now. I think that if the Fed blows this, people will be hurt. Millions of people could lose their jobs, their livelihoods, their life savings. Like what we had 10 years ago, people having to move out of their house into a car to take up food stamps for the first time in their life. It was horrible. We can't let that happen again. And of course, the Great Depression was worse. The last time the Federal Reserve said something like Janet Yellen, sorry, there's nothing more we can do, was in the early 1930s. And I believe that monetary economists promised Milton Friedman 20 years ago that they would make sure that something like that never happened again, that the Federal Reserve would never make that mistake again. We're not that far from making that mistake. So I'm not going to talk to you much about digital cash, except to say that we've tried to make a compelling practical proposal, really trying to think through the practical details. I'm a scientific advisor to the Swedish Central Bank. They're trying to think hard about how to implement digital currency. The ECB, the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada have a joint working group. The Federal Reserve should join that working group right away. And partly because it would benefit the U.S. monetary and payment system, but partly because we need to be ready. The title of my paper is Hope for the Best, Prepare for the Worst. Thank you.
Yeah. You got pretty excited.
So I can't think of a more fitting tribute to Marvin than to spend a full day talking about all his papers. And it's been really wonderful to hear the different ways that people knew Marvin. I think almost everybody in this room focuses on central banks. And certainly Marvin focused on central banks. But he didn't just focus on the Fed. And that makes him a little unique relative to many of the people in this room. Because at a time when it wasn't at all fashionable, he was focused on the Japanese central bank. Now, it's hard enough to understand what happens in a central bank. The nomenclature is not straightforward. The institutions are difficult. We have to work through financial intermediaries. Every country has different financial intermediaries. That's particularly true when you get to Japan. There are obvious language barriers. It's a difficult language to learn. The institutional arrangements are completely different. A lot of the other things that are occurring in terms of legal structure are very different. But Marvin actually took the opportunity to say, let's look at what's happening in Japan and not just dismiss it. Let's look at Japan and say, what do we learn from this experience and what can we bring to the United States to think about what could happen? So I'm going to start by talking about the same paper that was just discussed. The paper was the Overcoming the Zero Bound on Interest Rate Policy. It was in the JMCB. It was a paper prepared for the Woodstock Conference, which was a joint meeting of the Boston Fed and the Board of Governors. And it was actually it was a relatively four-sided conference, but Marvin's contribution was particularly far-sighted. Because at that time, the federal funds rate was 5.2%, and we were raising interest rates. We had not had the recession that was to occur shortly thereafter. We had not had the great financial crisis. And yet Marvin was spending time at that stage asking what happens when interest rates hit zero? What can a central bank do? What should a central bank do? That actually takes a particularly interesting thinker at a time when things aren't happening to say what happens if they go completely wrong. A little bit what was being suggested by the previous speaker, Andy. So Marvin was really prescient. He was asking about what happened. And when you go back and read that paper, there are things I don't agree with it, but there are two things that I think are really quite impressive. He actually, in many respects, had the playbook of central banks around the world that only occurred 10 years after he wrote the paper. So having that kind of prescience is pretty unusual. So what were the two things that he focused on? One was negative interest rates. So negative interest rates, he thought very carefully about what the institutional details of negative interest rates were at a time when it wasn't pervasive anywhere but Japan. And he thought very hard about what you do about the problem with currency having, not being able to easily go negative. He came up with suggestions that weren't always politically particularly popular, and I know he got into some difficulties with that paper. But he actually took it to a logical extreme to think about how could you actually do that, including kind of understanding the institutional arrangements about how you could do electronic reserves. In some sense, he was in effect talking about a digital currency. He was talking about a tax on currency. But he was really thinking quite broadly about how you actually implement negative interest rates. And he didn't really emphasize the negatives of that, but he did highlight there were negatives. So obviously people that depend on interest income are hurt by such policies. And obviously bank lenders can be stressed by such policies. So he was candid about the possibility that there would be problems with it, but he didn't just rule it out. He actually thought about it and thought about it very deeply. The second thing that he suggested in that same paper was the open market purchases of long-term bonds. So he was thinking about quantitative easing at a time when people really weren't talking about quantitative easing at all. But that really is, particularly for somebody who was a little bit concerned about what that meant between monetary and fiscal policy, that was thinking out of the box even for Marvin. But I would say he did have a caveat that got around this problem with the fiscal policy aspects, which was that the central bank should be indemnified by the Treasury Department in order to do that. Well, that's exactly the arrangement that the Bank of England actually took during the financial crisis. So when you look back at that paper, read through the paper, and say 10 years before we had the financial crisis, the playbook used by almost every central bank was actually laid out in some detail by Marvin's paper. That really is farsighted. And I don't think very many economists at that time, and then if you look at the rest of the conference papers, they were talking about it being very unlikely we hit the zero lower bound. If we hit the zero lower bound, we'll only be there for a quarter or two. And Marvin's saying, no, Japan's been there for quite a while. Why would I believe that? Let's think about what happens if that's not true. So if Marvin were here, what would he be thinking about? And what other further issues should we think about? Well, when Marvin was writing his paper, he couldn't have seen the things that we've seen over the last 20 years. So I think one thing that he did think a little bit about in his paper was how much space there is for monetary policy. So he thought that it was quite possible that the short rate would go to zero, and so his answer was to buy more long-term securities. During the financial crisis, we started with both the Fed funds rate and the 10-year rate above 5%. So we did get down to zero, but we had fortunately had the capacity to do more at the long end. We're now in a very different situation, as the comments previously stated, where both the Fed funds rate and the 10-year Treasury rate are well below 1%. And that poses a potential problem, because you can easily imagine a situation where we're much like Japan and Europe, and both the short end and the long end are both at zero. So buying 10-year Treasuries when the 10-year Treasury rate's zero doesn't help you very much. The 10-year Treasury would be no different than interest on reserves or buying the T-bills. So the typical quantitative easing probably doesn't work in the way that it did in the last crisis. So what would Marvin be thinking about? Well, actually, he kind of talks about buying other assets as long as you're indemnified. Now, the Federal Reserve Act doesn't allow us to buy a broader set of assets. So we'd have to either change the Federal Reserve Act, or you're back to liquidity facilities. But liquidity facilities that you would need to have Treasury indemnification. So I think if Marvin were here, he'd be saying, well, what are other foreign central banks doing? Japan and Europe are in a situation where the entire yield curve is basically at zero or negative in some countries. And so they're buying a wider variety of assets, but they're, for the most part, getting indemnified by their equivalent of the Treasury Department, or they have direct authority to do that. Now, in the second area, I don't know that you necessarily need a digital currency to have negative rates. It probably makes it easier to be not as limited. Marvin certainly explored the possibility of negative rates. I must say this is an area that I diverge a little bit from Marvin, and I wish Marvin were here for me to have the argument with him. And there are a number of reasons, and it's really not tied to what a digital currency solves. So my first concern is that monetary policy works through the banking system. And in countries where negative interest rates have occurred, they have low price-to-book ratios, lower return on assets, and lower leverage ratios. The banks are not in good shape in most countries that have negative interest rates. So if your hope is that the banking system is going to work effectively in a negative interest rate environment, I'm not so sure that's a good assumption. Now, there are many other reasons for why banks in Japan and Europe are not as good shape as in the United States. But I do think negative interest rates have been part of the problem. And I would say in other countries, they provide other support for large banks in a way that I don't think we would be able to in the United States. A second difference with the United States is that they have financial stability authorities in most other developed countries. So an implication of low interest rates for a very long time, or negative interest rates for a very long time, particularly if you're waiting till you get to a 2% inflation rate before you start raising rates, is that you have to worry about financial stability implications of very low rates for a very long time. So in other countries, there is some kind of authority that is thinking about financial stability issues, has authority to think about it, but also to do something. That is, do something with leverage on households or leverage on firms. There is no authority in the United States to think about financial stability in the way that we have in many other countries, which makes thinking about negative interest rates much more difficult, because one of the biggest collateral problems with negative interest rates, if held for too long, is you might get excessive leverage in households or firms. Now, there are obviously other ways to get around that. Excessive leverage could get different tax treatment, for example, so you don't necessarily need a central bank to do it. The fiscal authority could be thinking about ways to discourage excess leverage, but in the current environment, I think that's pretty unlikely. So you need to at least address, how do you think about financial stability? The third thing you have to think about is what happens with retirements and pensions. So the retirement and pension situation in Europe varies country by country. But in many of those countries, the result of the institutional arrangements with their retirement and pension arrangements is that when you get to negative interest rates, people start saving more, not less, which means you don't see more consumption, which makes it very hard for the economy to recover. So that is a problem if one of the ways that you think negative interest rates is going to work is that it's going to encourage people to spend more, but because of the pension arrangements in the country, you actually spend less and save more. So you'd at least have to spend a fair amount of time thinking about pensions, savings, and how people that are already retired are being impacted by that decision. In terms of negative interest rates, it's not clear to me that in Europe firms behave in a way that generates more investment. There have been a lot of studies that say that investments are not particularly sensitive to interest rates. That doesn't make me particularly optimistic they're going to be particularly sensitive to negative interest rates. And certainly the Japanese and European experience doesn't make me think about it much more optimistically. And the one area that I do think negative interest rates have a big impact on is exchange rates. The problem is everybody can't do it. So if the problem is that globally everybody's having a problem at the same time, everybody can't be beggaring thy neighbor. Somebody has to agree to keep rates high. And I'm not sure we'll be in that world. Now, there are obviously alternatives. Maybe we're asking monetary policy to do too much. So there is fiscal policy. And it's actually surprising we're not having more conferences on fiscal policy now rather than on monetary policy. Because in a very low interest rate world, we should be spending a lot more time thinking about how fiscal policy could do its job. So in the current situation, monetary policy is not going to create a vaccine. Monetary policy is certainly not the solution to public health problems. And if what you're worried about is not only the first problem, but then the second problem is what are the other organizations that are impacted, well, that's probably directed lending in a way that fiscal policy rather than monetary policy would be the first choice. So we need to spend more time talking about fiscal policy and its responsibilities when we have economic downturns. We should be having more discussion of automatic stabilizers when we have an economic downturn. We should have more discussion about public investment that yield positive returns. Certainly, more investment in the CDC would be one obvious example right now. So Marvin was incredibly good at thinking outside the box. This is probably a good time for us to once again start thinking outside the box. We can't just think about the alternatives we did before. We need to think about the alternatives for the future. And so I completely agree with Andy's point that we should be thinking about stressing the economy and alternatives. I think we actually do that. We may not talk as publicly about it, but it's an important part of what a central bank does, and we do spend time talking about it. But I think this is a good time for not just the central bank to think about it, but for everybody in this room and other policymakers as well. That's exactly what Marvin would be recommending. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Athanasios for inviting me to participate in this event. It's a real honor to highlight the influence of our esteemed colleague, Marvin Goodfriend, an outstanding, and as many have already mentioned, original thinker and researcher, policy advisor, and friend. Marvin epitomized the role of policy advisor. His research dug deep into the issues, introduced new ideas into the discussion, and developed options for policymakers to consider for the most challenging issues. The fact that we have so many researchers and policymakers here is a testament to the importance of his research in shaping the conversations we're having to this day. Now, listening to Al did remind me of my own Marvin story. Early in my career, back in the 90s, when I was freshly minted PhD working on monetary policy rules, perhaps with one of the papers with Andy back then. Can't remember which one it was, because all I do remember is my interaction with Marvin. And presented the paper, he asked some questions or something. We're like an NBR conference, we're on the side of the room. Marvin came to me full force, challenging everything that I said. And I didn't know, I knew who Marvin Goodfriend was. He's well known, and obviously, to everybody in monetary economics. But I'd never experienced firsthand the intensity of Marvin Goodfriend and the passion that he brought to thinking about monetary policy, of all things. So we had this lengthy discussion back and forth on the sidelines about monetary policy inertia, which is what we were debating then, or talking about. And we went back and forth, and I said, and Marvin had his own way of saying it, I had my way of saying it, back and forth. I said, Marvin, we're actually agreeing on the principles. I think we're just using different words. And he challenged me, said, no, that's not right. So we went back and forth, and finally at the end, he goes, no, you're right, John. We agree, that's good. Thought hard about it, dug into all the issues to make sure we both understood exactly what we were talking about, and then left the conversation feeling good. I'd gotten all this feedback from Marvin, felt much better about the kind of really thinking through the issue, and felt that coming to an alignment on this particular issue was important. I didn't know at the time, but I did learn years later that intensity and passion was even higher when we didn't agree. Okay, so before I reflect more on Marvin's contributions to monetary policy, I'm going to give the normal Fed disclaimer, which I think is appropriate. The views I express today are my own, and not necessarily those of anyone else in the Federal Open Market Committee or others in the Federal Reserve System. So I'm hoping we'll have a very stimulating discussion. So let me just give a few of the ways that Marvin has changed the conversation in the U.S. about what was commonly called back in the day the zero lower bound on interest rates, or ZLB. And these show how Marvin's insight shaped some of the most prominent discussions in monetary policy. Now, if you notice that Eric and my comments are very similar, it is not because I'm plagiarizing, nor is it because we coordinated. It's because I think for both of us, these are really, I think Marvin's contributions have had profound effect on our thinking at that time of the Woodstock Conference back in October '99. It is helpful to look back 20 years. As the clock ticked down on the 20th century, many people's attention wasn't on the ZLB. Most were actually more concerned about the upcoming millennium bug that would put the world on high alert. Truth be told, the ZLB wasn't perceived to be a looming problem in the United States back in 1999. Economy was very strong. The target Fed funds rate reached 5.5% by the end of the year. And up till then, the only real historical reference points for the ZLB were the Great Depression of the 30s, and more recently, the time was Japan's experience in the 1990s. So the ZLB just wasn't a experience of post-war Europe in post-war Europe or the Americas. However, a small group of economists with Marvin at the forefront was asking whether the ZLB could pose a challenge here in the U.S., and if so, what would be the consequences and what were the potential remedies? And researchers and policymakers began to turn the dial up on the discussion around the ZLB at this time. And I think a real key point is a conference that Eric mentioned, which was held in Woodstock, Vermont in October of 1999, focused really on the ZLB with a number of researchers presenting papers and a panel of policymakers. Marvin presented his paper, Overcoming the Zero Bound on Interest Rate Policy, which was published subsequently in the JMCB. And then in January 2002, Marvin briefed the FOMC directly on aspects of this research that he had presented back in Woodstock as part of a session that the FOMC had on the ZLB. And I was fortunate enough that with Dave Reichschneider to participate both in the conference and also in the presentation to the FOMC at that time. Now, by that time, in January of 2002, the funds rate was 1.75%. So the ZLB was starting to get more on policymakers' radar screens. On those occasions, Marvin emphasized the importance of the ZLB as a constraint on policy, and he urged all of us to think differently about how central banks could still carry out their missions, even under the constraint. He developed and analyzed what were then considered, the same phrase, outside the box options for overcoming the ZLB, and these help lay the groundwork for how economists and policymakers think about these issues, both in conceptual but also in very practical terms. For example, Marvin was one of the first people to think about how the constraint on the ZLB could be relaxed by implementing negative rates, Now, I know that, I guess I wasn't here, I wasn't here this morning, but whenever you talk about negative rates, you get quite a range of views, and it's a controversial topic. But whatever conclusions you may draw in thinking about the relative merits of negative rates, Marvin's research really did help identify those key issues and explored a broad dimension of the potential choices for policymakers around that issue. Marvin's intellectual pursuit of all aspects of the ZLB logically drove him to explore the possibility of a currency to have a digital component. And although many think of central bank digital currencies as a very newfangled idea, Marvin was thinking deeply about this prospect long ago. Of course, today, this is a topic that is being a hot topic in central banking today around the world. So the conversation that Marvin began in Woodstock in 1999 became the basis for discussions held at the FOMC within less than 3 years. And Marvin really expanded to the policymakers this idea of asset purchases as a policy tool that he first introduced back in his paper at Woodstock. And importantly, he emphasized that Fed asset purchases can affect financial conditions, thereby the economy. He was moving the economy away from just thinking about conventional monetary policy to specific unconventional options like the balance sheet. And he distinguished between central bank purchases of short-term government securities, as the Bank of Japan had been doing at the time, versus purchases of longer-term securities. Marvin viewed purchases of short-term securities as ineffective under the ZLB, while he saw the purchases of longer-duration securities as potentially a powerful tool owing to a preferred habitat motive on the part of investors. Of course, as Eric also said, large-scale asset purchases later became a tool of critical importance for easing financial conditions in the United States and abroad. Although the consequences of the predicted Y2K glitch were minimal, the ZLB became a central issue when the financial crisis hit. Thankfully, Marvin, along with others, helped lay the intellectual groundwork and create the vocabulary for all of us to work through some of the most significant issues facing central banks over the past decade. His work is a true emblem of how researchers play a vital role in informing and shaping the policy discussion. So I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes or so for questions. Anne-Marie.
A couple things that strike me. One is that just about anyway, what struck me is just about every analysis of crises that the Federal Reserve or other central banks has faced has been financial. The current one is not. The current one is, Jim referred to this morning, the main organization that's got to deal with this is the health organizations. The central bank's role has got to be, in some sense, accepting that real GDP is going to go down relative to what it would have done for a while, because to the extent that people can't get to work, that supplies don't get delivered, that's not a monetary issue. And I think that what I'm hearing is trying to fit it into a traditional box a little bit too much. And I'm not sure that I know the answer, but I know that the thinking has to get us a little bit out of that box. And then the other question that I hope is on the program next time is, why has our start or the neutral real rate come down for 20 years? Because I don't think we have a complete handle on that.
One of you guys want to weigh in on that?
You want to collect or?
Yeah, I know.
It's up to you.
All right, well, let's get... Okay, there.
Microphone over there.
Oh.
I was good to know.
When we're thinking about this kind of thing, I think it's useful to think about a worst-case assumption. And let me give you the assumption that I think is becoming prevalent on Wall Street at the moment. The assumption is that 30% of the world population will catch this disease, that there will not be a vaccine in time, or certainly not within the next year and a half or so, to save that. And if the 1% figure, which is the one generally thrown out, of mortality, that essentially means that 300 million people are going to die. In the United States, it means that 1 million people are going to die. Now, that will do terrific things for the actuarial assumptions in Social Security, but it will have almost no other positive effects that one can see. And under those conditions, this recession will go on for considerably longer. I think it's right that there's not much that monetary policy can do, but how do you think about those kinds of numbers, which I believe are a realistic worldwide phenomenon?
Eric, do you want to take that on?
No. Are we going to do all of them now, or?
Okay, we can do all the questions now. Any more questions? Yeah, Bob.
I think it's useful to potentially put. Yes. Sorry. I think it's useful to potentially put the current developments against the backdrop of financial crises in the 1800s in the United States, where typically what would happen is there would be a real shock. It was frequently associated with poor harvests or something like that. And then the issue was really the compounding of that underlying real shock with some financial dislocations or difficulties. And it seems useful for us to try to separate in thinking through what the appropriate policy responses are, things that affect the real shock and things that control those financial consequences.
Okay.
Thanks, Mike. Want to right on to both Anne Marie and Eric's comments there. From Anne Marie's comment about our star, would love to have some of you comment on Wixell's sort of other method in his 1898 paper, where he went on to say to use a supply and demand or liquidity or funds flow approach. Because when we look at, say, Bernanke's cash glut, we see reasons for why the neutral natural rate has been coming down for years. And then that goes into Eric's comments, where he talks about, sort of what else can we do and what lessons can we learn from Marvin. In the U.S., we put together the regulatory apparatus and the central bank. In Japan, they're separate. And I was one of the FSA's reviewers for a number of years because of my institutional investing role. And I'm still on their, FYI list. There, they're looking at the discontinuities in pieces of the financial markets. Because while we've got this cash glut going out there, which is tremendously demonstrated in the Fed financial accounts and the BIS, we've got lots of discontinuities. I can probably point to 6 meetings today in Manhattan about all the discontinuities in different little boxes of the capital structure. So there's potentially a lot that could be done by the Federal Reserve System through the FFIEC and through the SEC to try to reduce some of those discontinuities, just like Japan is attempting to do. And then that also plays into the whole virus thing, because a lot of the people paying the highest relative rates are also those sort of vulnerable businesses in this kind of situation. I'm thinking some of the media stories you see from Queens or Dayton, Ohio, and that sort of thing, where they're all the ones that are slammed with the discontinuities, even though double and triple A's are going to the global markets and getting things at all-time 100-year lows from Moody's. So both sides of that equation, would love your thoughts.
I'll take one more, and then I think we could let them answer, and then if there's time for some more. Yeah, back there.
A very simple question, just, economics 101. This shock, this COVID-19, seems to be more a supply shock than a demand shock. Shouldn't that increase inflation? And why would the Federal Reserve lower the interest rate if we have a positive inflation shock?
Let's answer these questions. You can start with the orders.
Okay.
No, I'll just start with a response. I think that President Rosengrun's comments were really insightful, and I appreciate all these, hearing all these memories of Marvin. I hope we can cherish those. As John said, I remember similar things too. He wasn't always the kind, gentle person, and that's good, right? The part of the, what we appreciate and treasure about him was exactly the passion and the courage. Okay, so sticking with this medical analogy for a moment, I think it's useful to think about chronic and acute. The ideal is you have an illness and the doctor gives you an injection and you have a pretty fast recovery. And in 81, 82, the Fed had to tighten a lot to bring inflation down. The US economy went into a very steep recession, unemployment hit 10%, but then the Fed was able to cut rates and we had a V-shaped recovery, and by 84, it was happy days are here again. And I think, so it seems clear that that's the ideal world we'd like to be in, is that when there's an aggregate demand shock, monetary policy can respond forcefully, cut interest rates a lot up front, and then get a quick recovery and get in and get out. And the problem with the policy, as we've gotten more and more stuck at the zero bound for 20 years, is turning an acute thing into a chronic problem. The economy goes forward pretty well, and maybe the Fed is able to raise rates again by the end of the year. What I think we have to be concerned about is the more severe adverse scenarios. How do those work? Well, we know that half of U.S. households have very little savings, very little access to credit. If some of those households have to stay home with their kids, they're going to lose income. And that's going to hurt car sales. It's going to hurt, construction and lots of other things that we know are going to be coming. We call those aggregate demand shocks. And so the rationale for the Fed to cut rates is the extent to which businesses are cutting back on projects, consumers are getting scared, spending less. And if that problem goes on for 6 or 9 months and keeps getting worse and worse, and monetary policy is frozen at the zero bound, that's becomes a worst case scenario, for the price level and employment, which is the Fed's mandate. So I think, again, I don't think we know yet whether this is just an aggregate supply shock or an aggregate demand shock, a mixture of the two, whether it's transitory or persistent. But we got to be prepared. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
So several of the questions were tied to, is this primarily a supply shock and not a monetary phenomenon? And I think there's certainly an element of both supply and demand that we have to be thinking about. So monetary policy doesn't put more goods on ships from Korea, Japan, and China. So obviously, if it's only a supply shock, then lowering interest rates doesn't do us much good. But as Andy just said, there's a good reason to believe that consumer confidence isn't going to be helped by what's been happening with the stock market or what they're reading in the newspaper. There's a reasonable expectation that companies are going to cut back on investment given the uncertain environment. And so in that environment, I think there's probably going to be a demand as well as a supply element to it. And so if we find ourselves in a situation where we're below our inflation target, possibly by much more than we had anticipated, and if we find that we're not anywhere close to full employment as a result of this, who knows what the outcome's going to be? I think it's way too soon to know. But if that were the case, then you would want to use monetary policy to try to reach the dual mandate that we have. So even though we can't create vaccines and we can't offset the health outcomes, we can help asset valuations by having a lower discount rate, and we can help leveraged households and firms hopefully weather the crisis a little bit better with lower interest rates. So it's not that improving financial conditions doesn't help. I think it does help, and depending on exactly how we analyze this over time, it might be appropriate to make sure that we provide enough accommodation that we don't have a situation where we missed both elements of our mandate, possibly by much more than we had anticipated. So I think we have to think about the financial dislocation. I would say one of the problems that you do have to worry about is after a period of low interest rates for a long period of time, a lot of our corporate sector has a lot of leverage. And so that is one of the negative outcomes of having low interest rates for a long time. We'll see how much of a problem that creates for unemployment and other things if this were to persist for longer than we hope it does. So I think we do need to be thinking about what the appropriate monetary policy response is. And I don't think the right analysis in the end is likely to be it's only a supply shock. I think we probably already have some evidence that it's both a supply and demand shock. I would say, though, that for many, we have asked monetary policy to do an awful lot, and fiscal tools might be much more effective at the first set of problems, which are tied to what we want for public health and what we want for thinking more broadly about possibly directed lending to the kinds of businesses that have most been impacted. That's really a political issue, not so much a monetary policy issue. And I think that's why we have a democracy that thinks about these issues, is they're the most appropriate first way of thinking about it. And if they choose not to act and we're far from where we should be, then we have to think about what the next set of policies are. I suggested, well, one or two that we could at least think about. I remain less convinced than you of the negative interest rates, but I think we need to think broadly about what tools we would use in that case, and that is something we should all be thinking about.
I never miss a chance to talk about R-star, so I'm going to do that. The question was the neutral interest rate, why has it fallen for the last 20 years? What do we know about that? And a couple things I would say. First of all, we don't know what the neutral rate is with any precision, but we have seen a pattern across many jurisdictions, countries, economies, using a lot of different methods, whether models or just purely empirical analysis or a combination of the two, that I think provide pretty compelling evidence that neutral interest rates have fallen. Short-term real interest rates consistent with steady growth and price stability have fallen in Europe and Asia, the United States, and other advanced economies. And I think that's been going on for decades. It's not just a result of the experience post-financial crisis. And I think there's no signs of that reversing. So I think the world of very low neutral interest rates is likely to stay with us. So the question really, though, was why, what's happening? And again, I don't think we can say anything with certainty, but there's been a lot of research, both by academics and Fed and other central bank economists, highlights three important components. One is, I think they're common across the globe. One is demographics. People are both living longer on average, and that's good. But birth rates and labor force growth is much slower throughout most countries in the world. Those tend to drive neutral rates lower. We've seen lower productivity growth across the globe than we had in previous decades. Arguably, that's also a factor driving the neutral rate lower. And the third is, in the broad category of, things like global savings glut, or think about convenience yield or spreads between safe and more risky assets. We've seen that relationship change over previous decades, again pushing down the neutral interest rate on very safe assets like Treasury securities or Fed funds. So all three of those factors seem to play a major role in this development that's been going on for decades. I think on demographics and productivity trends, those tend to be very slow moving, and I don't see them turning around anytime soon. I think some of the other factors, such as the convenience yield or savings glut, those could be affected by policies in different countries, and so that's something that could change. But right now, the evidence based on the models that I work on and many others show the neutral rates all the way through the end of last year. The estimates still low. So that's my concrete answer on that. Going back to the supply-demand shock, I kind of think Bob got exactly right. Supply shocks cause demand responses. They cause effects in the financial and the banking system that are spillovers. The judgment we have to come to as policymakers, especially in this kind of situation where we don't have the data flow and all the analysis, we're basing this on, looking at projections of developments in terms of the coronavirus, in terms of what we're seeing around the globe. The analysis says, yes, obviously there's a supply shock aspect. Clearly there's a effect on financial markets. Clearly there's effect on confidence, and it's got a major uncertainty aspect. One of the things we've learned from researchers over the past decade is heightened uncertainty tends to cause people to pull back from investments, whether businesses or households. So there's an uncertainty aspect to that, and obviously all the macroeconomic spillovers. We won't know for sure what that mix exactly is and entails. So as policymakers, you have to reach a judgment. But my view is that it's not purely a supply shock. There are definitely these demand and other spillovers and other factors that are definitely in play and I think will potentially play an important role. Going back to central banks, often I hear this phrase, that everyone's counting on central banks to solve all problems. I think everyone in the Fed, my colleagues, I gave a speech yesterday highlighting this point. This current coronavirus outbreak is clearly, first and foremost, a health issue. It's the first line of defense, if you will, is going to be, and is today, the doctors, the nurses, the healthcare professionals who are working on that. We understand that as central bankers. That's really where this fight to contain the outbreak and to treat the people who are affected is happening. I think governments do have an important role to play as well in supporting financially and through other policies the healthcare response across the globe, and obviously, if needed, as needed, providing fiscal stimulus to the economies where that targeted fiscal stimulus can have its biggest impact. That said, central banks, including the Fed, have an important role to play side by side with the healthcare response with fiscal authorities. Central banks have the important role to play both in providing support to the economy, as Eric said, in pursuit of our dual mandate goals. Obviously also in supporting effective functioning of financial markets and financial stability. And so, I don't see this as central banks or the government or someone else. It's actually for us to maximize our effectiveness in what is a very uncertain and quickly evolving situation. We need all of these things working highly effectively together to address the coronavirus and all of its implications.
Okay, I'm going to stop. That's it. Okay, so we're going to take a break now, and 20 minutes? 15.